Welcome to our interview series with women human rights defenders. Today we speak with Veronica Vidal de Giorgis. Veronica is an Argentinian, Uruguayan feminist activist and women human rights defender based in Mexico City. Until very recently, Veronica was deputy director of Prodesk, a Mexican intersectional feminist human rights organization working in particular on economic, social, and cultural rights. Previously, Veronica held various positions at the Association for Women's Rights in Development. She has worked as a researcher and advocate in Uruguay and Mexico, with a focus on regional integration processes, international cooperation for development, environment and civil society, as well as in building networks, documentation of attacks, and developing protection approaches with women human rights defenders from a feminist perspective. Veronica is also a board member of Frontline Defenders. Veronica, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jaroslavna, for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here today with you.
Thank you. Veronica, you have worked on women's rights across several countries in Northern, Central, and South America. How did the repression and violence that women face in these regions change over years, in your opinion?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. It's very important, especially if we speak about today, but I'm gonna maybe to make a baseline, from where to start, because this is a region that has been for many, many decades, especially a very violent region for women. We are one of the regions that suffered the highest rates of femicide in the world. That means that women are killed just for the fact of being women. And Mexico is particularly an important case to understand that phenomenon. But to go more on how that repression evolved over the years, I would like to maybe start even with my childhood in the 80s, when we were coming out from various cruel and very harsh dictatorships in the region, like Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Chile, for example, that in the late 80s started the democratization processes. When that happened, that opened a door for civil society to expand. Even within the process of democratization, civil society and human rights defenders at that time, we could call it social fighters, or they had other names. They were not human rights defenders as we understand today, or activists, political activists, expanded what we now call civil society, and they started to organize and to push for those democratization process. So that was a moment of still a lot of repression, when marches were on the streets, referendums had place in the country. So the repression was, of course, from the state forces that were against, this democratization process that still exists. And in that regard, women played a crucial role in that democratization process. We can name, for example, the case of Madres de Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, and the mothers that organized as well in Uruguay or in Chile, that were looking for many, many years already their disappeared relatives, right? In that regard, when we approach, for example, the 90s, that I think it was kind of a decade when the human rights movement flourished. And that was, I think, a decade where repression was maybe not seen. And it was also the decade for seeking for women, for example, in Guatemala, that in Central America, civil wars and dictatorships and were really harsh. They were looking for transitional justice processes, right? And women were the ones that pushed more to bring dictators and to the courts, even to international courts, to bring justice. Of course, as the 2000s evolved, we started to see, for example, many backlashes against the agenda and the achievements that we built during the 90s, for example, but we can see how the repression was exercised when we started to see anti-war movements, or when the Pinochet was held in London, and also that put a lot of pressure on states for not how can I say, yes, to exercise their power and the use of force to repress, pacific movements, and also seeing the backlash on the war on terror. And I think in Latin America, what happened is that women movements have always been at the forefront of many social justice struggles. And that also put, we put our bodies and our also gender and our politics on the streets. And that was also a way to, yes, to challenge, patriarchal structures and gender stereotypes that women need to be on their homes, taking care of their families and children. And that also, it's for states, structures that are really patriarchal and wants to, to silence our voices. That was a way to start repressing. And repression can have evolved also with repression on the street, with unjustified arrest, forced disappearance. That has never ended. That's also sad, and also has evolved in terms of, because we think about repression and we think immediately about the use of force, but also that repression has also evolved in ways like, for example, imposing legislation that impedes the work of women human rights defenders, activists, organizations, and movements. The use of the judicial system to harass and bring charges to human rights activists and women defenders. So I think that has been what we now call the closed of the civic space, and that has been transformed and increased a lot since the 2000s.
Thank you very much for this great overview. And since you mentioned the strength of the feminist movements across Americas, I wonder what tactics do you think were most effective to counteract the repression against women?
Well, I think overall, the feminist movements generally, or even human rights work, has always entailed not just one tactic. No, that's also, we have to use varied and intertwined, strategies and tactics to either influence. For example, I think the influence in legislative changes and public policy has been one of the strategies that the feminist movements have been using. Also, I think we have had a lot of mobilization on the street. Like I mentioned the previous example of Madres de Plaza de Mayo, the Quilombolas in Brazil, the women's movement in Chile. They have also been, and also in Central America, being on the streets and marching and protesting has been also a tactic that has been used to push for changes in the public sphere, right? And also, for example, the movement on sexual and reproductive rights in Argentina or El Salvador around the abortion laws and yes, and provide sexual health to women in the region as well. That had sparked also a lot of mass mobilization, women into politics, pushing for those changes, activists and other stakeholders that took that that flag and make it happen. It took many years But I think we are seeing some progress on that regard, and I think that also it's because of the many tactics. You know, it's not just one. It's like protest, it's advocacy, is community work, it's communication, being advocates in our houses as well. Feminists, we generally are kind of vocal, and the bad member of the family always, bringing those harsh conversations to our tables. And I think we do the work at many levels, to the macro level, to the micro level, and we do that at the same time. It hasn't been possible to use one tactic to achieve or to gain the rights for women in the region, and I think that's also a global phenomenon, right?
Yes, indeed, this is so true, and thank you for saying this. I also wonder, since you also worked explicitly on economic, social, and cultural rights, I wonder how, in your view, can the principles of intersectional feminism be integrated into work on, in particular, economic, social, and cultural rights?
To start with, I think intersectionality has been understood and developed as a frame of analysis. And that frame of analysis allows us to see that how the many identities that one person brings into the world can intersect with systems of inequality and discrimination. And that approach acknowledges the effects of how multi-dimensional inequalities could be based not just on gender. That it was kind of what we are used. Gender is you are male or you are female, but also you bring a race with you, you bring ethnicity, you bring sexual orientation, you bring gender identity, disability, class, or other forms that of discrimination that people lived. So for me, in my experience in working with communities, mixed communities in Mexico, and that are working on the defense of their economic, social, and cultural rights, for example, in the defense of their land and territory, it's really important that you bring that lens when we are accompanying and trying to bring strategies for them to defend their land, for example. You have a mixed community, and you have generally women and men, but those women or men are not just women and men. They are indigenous, they live in rural areas, they might have disability, they might have a sexual orientation that differs from the large of the community. And bringing that analysis and know who is who and how those identities intersect can also bring a lot of richness in understand how within the community those identities can impede, the access to rights or not. So for me, it's just a lens of analysis, and it's not easy. I think it has a lot of critics, and it's something that has been evolving as also we practice intersectional feminism. But I think the paramount thing about intersectionality is that it allows to see the multiple layers of discrimination and how that relates to the access to power and access to resources, to resources of different type.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Veronica, until very recently, you were deputy of Prodesk, and you are also a board member of Frontline Defenders. How, in your opinion, can women human rights defenders in positions of certain power or influence uplift women human rights defenders in, let's say, less privileged or powerful positions?
Yeah, that's also a tricky question, at least for women. And talking about power is also hard for women. And also to be knowledge, I think for me has been, first of all, recognize the power, and also to understand power differently, because I think I see and feel and live power very differently of how we are used to understand power. We generally grow with the understanding of power with the use of force, you know, or in authoritarian ways that impose our will on others. And I think it has also been associated with male force and masculinity. And I think for women, and especially feminists, we have struggled with the use of power and exercise of power due to the patriarchal structures that we live in. And in that regard, the problem then is how we have lived power and for the purpose it serves. So for me, the real power from a feminist lens is when it's seen as a force of collaboration, transformation, instead of destruction and domination. And in this regard, I think my ethical approach to power is first to acknowledge my position of privilege, and also to share to the extent that I can that privilege, to share my knowledge and to receive, because I don't think, because I am in a position of power because I have had privileges that others might not have had. So recognizing that is, for me, that's the first things to do.
Thank you very much for this honest response. And given that this is a series with women human rights defenders, and I wonder what could be the words of encouragement or advice or a lesson learned maybe from you that you would like to share with other women human rights defenders out there?
Maybe I would like to tell them, to tell us that we need to believe in our power, first of all, and our power to transform, that every one of us has certain form of power. Some of us have it in our voice, someone on our art to express resistance. I think all those forms of power all the forms of power among ourselves are valid if they are used to transform and create a world that everybody can fit. And I think we need to celebrate more of our achievements, that I think we need to be there for one another. That could be kind of maybe common sense, but sometimes it's not. And acting solidarity across our multiple struggles. You know, it's not that I just need to be in alliance or in solidarity with the women human rights defenders that are in my same movement, but you know, we don't live single lives, as Audre said. So I think we need to have more cross-movement solidarity among ourselves in the pursuit of gender justice and equity. And also I think I would like to see among ourselves more politics of care. For me, it's paramount in a world that always put us one against the other. And also I think I want to share that we need to think more about also pleasure. Even I know that might be hard in the context we live in and the harsh realities that many of us are in. But I think also we need to think about more pleasure, what gives us pleasure, because we are all the time bombarded with so many sad things that sometimes we need to revalue that, what brings us pleasure also in the work we do, and that we need to think about our self and collective care as a political, as political for our work, that if we don't take care of ourselves, we cannot continue the work. So yeah, I think those are my maybe wishes or encouragement to ourselves to keep us talking, right? And I think also this context of isolation, it has been really hard for many of us to not be in touch, you know, to not being able to be together and to make our gatherings and, you know, make our rituals. I think rituals for women are really important, at least in this part of the world, and I know in others as well. Maybe they might come in different forms and shapes and colors, but I know they exist. So I think, yes, I think we need to feel more and feel nicer about the things we do.
Thank you so much for this great and very kind words. And thank you for sharing all the insights with us today, and for your great work. And thank you so much for watching us today, and see you in the next interviews.